What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Level 10 YouTube page. This is part 2 of the training discussion that you saw from myself, Coach Tom, and Coach Shelby. We have a couple of the other Level 10 coaches with us today, Coach Tori and Coach Brad. And we're going to be continuing the discussion that we had last week about kind of training intensity and why that may be the main reason that you're not seeing the response or the results that you want to see from your training, and lead that into what should your training actually look like. If you're new to the gym, or even if you're kind of like an intermediate to advanced level athlete, what should your training look like to optimize your results in terms of how many times should you be going to the gym, what you should be doing in the gym, basically what those workouts should look like, and then maybe also some things to avoid. So to start it off, the general concepts, the main variables to take into consideration when it comes to any type of training programming is going to be your volume, your intensity, and your frequency. Now, we talked about intensity last week, so really that's kind of like your approximation to failure, how difficult the work is that you're doing. In some sense, you can look at that on a different level. Sometimes people will program intensity based off of a percentage of your 1 rep max and things like that. But ultimately, it's the level of effort that you're putting forth, which affects how much work you can or should be doing, because the harder that you work, the harder it is to recover from. So that could dictate how much work you're doing in one individual session, how much work you're able to do across the week as a whole, how you have to distribute that work, et cetera, et cetera. So let's start with just kind of like what I think is the initiator of all of this. Like, the first thing you have to figure out is kind of like, how much work should I be doing? And that will give you a basis of, okay, well, how do I distribute that across the week? So volume, essentially the amount of work that you're performing as a whole, right? And each of us as coaches may have different viewpoints as to what that means. I take the stance at this point, and the way that I kind of count it and measure it is the number of hard sets that you are performing across the week as a whole. And you can look at that in totality, like just the number of sets that you do, period, or probably more ideally on a muscle group or movement pattern basis. So how many chest sets you're doing throughout the week, or how many press sets you're doing throughout the week, things like that. So does anybody else look at it differently in terms of how you're quantifying what volume means? Because there are different ways to look at it, which some do have merit as well.
I would, since coming a little bit more from the strength side, I primarily calculate volume for my compound lifts or my main movements, to where then that ultimately how hard those days are essentially just dictates how aggressive I go on accessory work. But since it's a little bit more variable and I don't necessarily track those as in detail, I'm more concerned with volume for the compound main movements of my blocks.
But you're still counting them in sets, right? Like, that's how you are quantifying
sets. Yep, sets, weight, and then kind of that total volume there.
Tom, you do the same thing?
I used to, but I'd say I'm more leaning towards what you were describing before now. I'm more looking just broadly across the board at muscle group,
just like how much work you're doing.
Yeah.
I do that as well, unless there is context for like a specific movement that they're trying to improve. So
Right.
If we're trying to specifically increase strength and pull-ups, then I'll have a lot more of a dialed in view of how much volume is being done week to week on that specific performance improvement.
Yeah, I think at this point, all of us take a more big picture, broad perspective in regards to volume, because when I first started, it was much more narrowed down and specific. Maybe it's just me because I'm a numbers guy, but volume can also be kind of calculated out. Volume load, specifically weight times sets times reps. So you can get an actual number as to how much volume you perform, and you could technically use that as a metric to progress, whether it be week by week, month to month, to say that specific volume load is going up, so I'm doing what I need to do. And that does give us some good applicable things to take away, because it does, encourage us to either add weight, add reps, or technically you could add sets as well to increase that volume load. But me just mentioning that brings up kind of like, well, if you're adding sets, you're also now really drastically changing the volume. So to me, it's not the best way to look at it. More big picture, thinking about what are your main goals. If you do have goals to do like pull-ups and whatnot, you should be looking specifically at those type of exercises, the amount of work you're doing, and things like that. So in general, volume, the amount of work that you do throughout the week, is going to be the number of hard sets you do per muscle group or per movement pattern, period, for the entire week, usually a 7-day span, right? So once you kind of have that figured out, which from a like recommendation standpoint, the literature, if you look it up, and most people I would say are probably going to tell you you should be somewhere within the 10 to 20 sets per week range. I would say that, you know, that range might actually even be a little bit broader than you think, depending on your intensity and your frequency. So if you're training really, really hard with high intensities and going all the way to failure all the time, you could probably get away with doing 6 hard sets per week, something like that. If you're leaving 4 or 5 reps in reserve every single working set that you do, you could probably do 25 sets and recover fine, right? So somewhere within that range, I would say, is kind of my opinion. For movement pattern or muscle group, you're going to be wanting to do 10 to 20 is a safe range, I would say. You guys agree with that?
Yeah, and it probably depends on your training status as well. If you're a beginner, you can lift twice and do like 2 to 3 sets, and you're probably going to see some type of an adaptation versus a trained individual.
Right. I mean, a lot of the studies do have people doing 5 sets per week and compare that to much higher volumes. And in almost every single one of those studies, there are people who make progress on 5 sets per week. So even if you're getting, somebody's telling you like higher volume is better, or the more that you do, the more results that you get, the research kind of leads towards that way. But you also have to remember that's all based off on averages, which means that there are some people who are responding really, really well to very, very little. Not, you know, just because you're doing less doesn't mean you're not going to be growing or getting stronger, building muscle at all. You may respond to more to better to more, but you may also respond better to less, right? So yeah, if you're a beginner, I would start for sure below that 10 per week, or at least don't go above it, right? So once you kind of have that generalized concept of this is how much work that I plan to do throughout the week as a whole, that will then lead you to, okay, well, how am I going to distribute that total work across the week, which comes into your frequency. So let's just take the very high end, for example. If your goal is to do 20 sets per week of, let's say it's bench press specifically, or it's chest work specifically, theoretically, you could do 20 sets in one session and call that your work for the week. Some people actually prefer doing that. Some people do get good results with that, but you don't have to do it that way. And you theoretically could get a better response, recover better, have higher quality work if you split that work up and say, I'm going to have 2 sessions where I do 10 sets in each, or maybe even 4 sessions where I do 5 sets in each, right? So I don't know how, if you guys want to like talk about the best way that you start with like a client individually, like what considerations you take to say, all right, well, here's how much we probably should be doing. How do we actually put that together in a program for you individually?
Yeah, I'll look at their what their preferred number of days per week training is and kind of distribute it from that point on. So somebody that's 3 days a week, I'm focusing more on the major compound movements all 3 of those days in some capacity. So if we're thinking of like back, I'd like to hit a vertical pull and a horizontal pull at least 2 of the 3 days, if not all of the 3 days, maybe doing, 2 vertical pulls and 1 horizontal pull. But I want to hit back all 3 of those days in some capacity, or I could do a vertical, a horizontal, and then a maybe more isolated back movement, like a straight arm lat pull down. But I'm distributing that across the board as opposed to doing, upper lower across 4 days, where I would be distributing across 2 upper body days. So, and that's also dependent on your splits, which we can get into either now or in another discussion, just talking about splits. But for most of my 3-day-a-week clients, which is the base intro level client, if you're coming from nothing, you're going to make a lot of progress off of 3 days anyway. You can get by, right? 3 sets, you're hitting your 9 sets ish of back. Maybe with one other accessory exercise, you're getting into the 12 set range, and then you're covering all of your back volume. So I kind of like will look, if I'm designing a completely new template, I'll start filling in like a body part first across the 3 days, and then I'll do the next body part or compound type movement across the 3 days. And I'll just fill it in from there, kind of cycling through.
I think it's important to establish that like you're using a 3-day example for some people.
Yes.
I do like that that's the example that you're using, because that is certainly enough. And a lot of people might think that like, if I only go to the gym 3 days a week, I'm not going to, like, that's not enough work. It definitely is. It definitely can be. But how do you come to that decision? Like, I have a new client, they have this goal. how do you
Yeah.
get we're doing 3 days per week in the gym?
Yeah, I think the big thing with days per week is your lifestyle. What's realistic for you? Are you going to make it to all 3 days? Because if you try to tell me like I want to train 5 days a week, but then you tell me about your busy lifestyle and how it's going to be really hard for you to achieve getting there 5 days a week, but you're adamant you want to train 5 days a week and you squeeze it in, and you got a lot of stress, you got a lot of work, you got a family, all this stuff, and you're trying to fit 5 days a week in training. I might look at you and say, why don't we go to 3 and make 3 quality workouts, full day splits where we know we're going to hit all the body parts, all 3 of those days? Because if I give you a 5-day split, right, now I'm not doing 5 full body days. I'm probably hitting maybe back and buys, chest, and the traditional bro splits or whatever you want to call it. But if I miss a day in that 5-day split because my life is so busy, now that day it's going to be like 14 days before I do the next back day if I miss back. That's why you have to be realistic with what you're going to do. Siri's talking to me. But you have to be realistic with what you're going to do. If you know you're going to be able to get to the gym 5 days a week, that's great. You can handle it and you progress towards that, great. But as you're starting off, you need to be realistic with the amount of days. Because I've gotten notes from some of the other coaches. Hey, you're going to program for this client. They're adamant they train 6 days a week. I told them no, they're training 3 days a week because it's just not realistic.
Yeah, I think preference and lifestyle have to be blended together because oftentimes they disconnect, right? People
And
want.
I also feel like conditioning status makes the difference too. Like if you have a brand new person who's either coming back from a hiatus or coming back postpartum or coming back after injury, they're not ideally going to be jumping into 6 days of aggressive training right after that. So factoring in again those lifestyle demands and not just with the schedule, but also with what their body can handle. If you have a client who is their goal is to like get their period back and re-stabilize their metabolism, 6 days of training is also not going to fit for that goal. So all context dependent.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point, Tori. Like recoverability like has to be factored in as well. Like if you're feeling like you got run over by a truck after your 5th or 4th training session, but you still are planning to do 2 more, how effective and efficient are those training sessions probably going to be? You're probably just going to be going through the motions, and you might be better off if you reallocated that volume into 4 intentional days, call it a week, and then actually recover and be able to perform better and progress week after week, right? Instead of always running yourself into the ground.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically the conversation I have too, is I'm good with 4 days. Like if people feel they need to do something a little bit more consistently, that's fine. But kind of as Tom said, I explained it very clearly, I'm still starting with the general same volume. And it's just, is it the total volume divided by 4 or divided by 3? Like you take your pick. And so, and even for some people who are like, no, I want 4 days, but I want more recovery. We do like 4 days over an 8-day week. And, it's just basically, a little division divided evenly or have heavier and lighter days. But ultimately it is kind of meeting them in that middle of what works for them, but also making sure they understand that you have a reason behind this volume. And it's not just, you want them to only exercise 3 days a week.
Right. I think that might be a concept that a lot of people don't grasp, is that the way that we've just like structured this conversation is we started with figuring out what our volume requirements are going to be first, or like what we want to shoot for. And then we break that down to how often we get into the gym. So it's not the other way around. We don't dictate, well, if I'm going to the gym 6 days per week, that means I'm doing a ton more work. Not necessarily. Like in the way that we program, you're probably still doing roughly the same weekly volume. We're just allocating it differently. So it's not necessarily more, it's not necessarily better. So more realistically, what you have to think about is what is more realistic for you to actually adhere to, right? So that kind of breaks it down in terms of, here's the average range you should shoot for in terms of this, how much work and volume you want to perform throughout the week. Take your kind of preference, your training status, what you've done in the recent past, and formulate what makes the most sense for you as to how many days to break that across the board. And then we can briefly talk about, okay, now you figured out that you're doing 3 to 4 workouts per week. You're aiming for this amount of volume. Like, what does that actually mean? What do the workouts look like? And Tom, you've kind of hinted at this already with your description around the 3-day workouts where you're going to do full body every single day. So you're doing 3 sets of back each day or something like that. And we can get a little bit more specific about what does that actually mean? If you're training your back for 3 sets on each of those 3 upper body days, you did mention, you prioritize compound movements there versus anything else, because it's going to give you the most bang for your buck. It's going to give you the most stimulus for the amount of time and the amount of work that you have available. And so I think we can all agree that no matter if you're doing 3, 4, 5, 6 days a week, that's typically the general structure that we would like to abide by. Is when you're fresh at the beginning of the workout, you're going to put most of your energy towards what's going to give you the most back. And that's going to be your compound movements, your multi-joint movements, your big or heavy lifts, right? And Brad, you might do this a little bit differently, because especially for yourself, because you program much more strength focused. But I still think no matter what your goal is, building muscle or strength, that's where you're going to put forth the majority of your effort.
Yeah. So yeah, I basically like kind of any stuff that would be before that I program would be classified as that warm up. So if I'm not just doing the movement specific warm up, very, very light, some increasing blood flow, just like targeting that movement pattern. But then whether it's a specific strength block or more hypertrophy endurance, we're still starting with compound movements as well. Because that then also, just going back to the person's availability, I also want to just set up that if, this week I can only get in 3 20-minute sessions, I want to hit the compound, the main movements, and get out. And so maybe individual specific why we might start isolation first on certain things, but I'd say the general majority, myself included, is compound first, just to make sure I have the most energy available, I'm freshest, and we can hit those hard.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the reasoning behind that is twofold, right? Like if you're restricted on time in a compound movement, you're going to be training multiple muscle groups simultaneously. So you're directing volume and intention to, like in a bench press, you're going to not only be training your chest, but also your shoulders and your triceps as well, right? So you're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone and allocating some volume to multiple muscle groups at once. You're also able to, in those movements, those exercises, because you're moving at multiple joints and using multiple muscle groups, produce more force and generate more tension in general. You're going to be able to lift heavier weight. And so the overall stimulus is likely going to be higher than an isolation movement. If you think about it from a numbers perspective, if you're bench pressing, you can move hundreds of pounds, for most men, even for women, it's a lot more than if you were to do, let's say, a chest fly, which is still training your chest, but that's at 1 joint, that's isolating 1 muscle group. The amount of weight, the amount of tension you're going to be able to generate is much smaller, right? So that's why we want to prioritize those earlier on in the session, and then gets to the isolation stuff later, or accessory work later, if you even need it, because again, you're still training those smaller muscle groups through those compound exercises as well. And I think, Tori, you kind of brought up kind of like what not to do before we started recording this in the workouts. And that made me think about kind of like how many workouts or exercises you should be doing in these workouts. So when we're talking about like your compounds before your accessories, my opinion is we're talking like 1 to maybe 2 compounds, and then 2 to like probably 3, if 4 max isolation. So we're talking like 2 to 5 total, maybe 2 to 6 total exercises in your session as a whole, right? And that may seem like that might seem like it's not enough to a lot of people, but I think the majority of us would be like, that's a very typical standard, maybe even on the higher end of the amount of, workouts or exercises rather we're going to do in each one of our workouts.
Especially when you factor in how intentional and how the intensity should be in those training sessions. I remember at least like a mistake that I made before I had any knowledge on exercise programming. I was trying to do like 8 to 10 exercises, trying to hit every single muscle group multiple times, 4 sets of 10 to 12 for every single one. And I'd make it through maybe 1 or 2 weeks on that type of a program, and then I would completely burn out. But then I would get frustrated thinking, I just wasn't training hard enough. But that's the actual opposite of what is going on. So I think it's more common for people to do too much work than to do too little.
And that goes back to, I think I mentioned it in this call at some point too, but it goes back to our intensity talk in last week's video, where if you are training with an actual close approximation to muscular failure, like you are taking it all the way there, the fatigue that you're going to generate when doing that is going to limit the amount of effective work that you can actually get done in that session. So if you are, finding yourself doing what Tori described and getting through 8, 9, 10 different exercises, and you still like have the energy to do so, that likely means that the work that you did wasn't hard enough. You know what I mean? And that's not to say that like, yeah, you were burning calories and yes, you were training those muscles, but likely not for the actual stimulus that we're looking for, which is like we talked about on the last video. Like most people are looking to actually look different. They want to build muscle and build strength. And in order to do that, the intensity requirement, has to be met. And that brings a lot more fatigue than people think, like in the acute sense and across the workout as a whole. And that could lead us into talking about rest periods and things like that. But it's hard to recover from hard work. It really, really is.
Yeah. So if you're trying to put in like deadlift and then squat and then bench press and then a bent over row, like squeezing all of that into one workout, like how will you survive?
Good luck if you're working hard.
Yeah.
And I think, because I fall into this trap too, is most of our clientele are over, the 17, 18 years of age, obviously. And when I was 17, 18, getting into training, I did do eight exercises, 4x10 of every exercise. And there was growth because one, I had never trained at all. And I just was like a weed. I ate food and I grew. And I look back now and it's like, I get in that mindset of, okay, I can do more. But as just both you get older and as you get more trained, that's where you have to actually start to train smarter. And so now, like you said, I might do a main compound and what I call my main accessory, which is typically another compound, but less volume of that. And then maybe 3 accessory type exercises and I'm out. And so it's just sometimes I think a lot of my clients look back to what they did when they were 18. And I'm like, well, we're 35 now. And so we have to understand we train to how we live and things like that too.
That's probably a big point of disconnect for a lot of people. And you hinted on this earlier, Brad, but when you're a brand new beginner to training, almost anything that you do is going to be effective. So it can really skew people's perceptions because Brad found himself in that scenario where, oh, well, I can do 10 exercises, 10 sets each and do a crap ton of work in each session. And that worked for me. Like that's what I should be doing. Someone else could have had the exact opposite experience where they went to the gym, and did 2 exercises and did 2 sets of each. And they also saw tremendous growth. So both of these people could come at the same thing and be like, no less is better, no more is better. When you're at those beginning stages, anything that you do is going to drive adaptations. It's once you get to that, like you said, that more advanced level where you have to really factor into how much work should I be doing? How intense should that work be? And how often should I be doing it? Right. And you have to find the common blend between the 3 that works best for each individual person. And I think the last thing that I definitely want to talk about as we finish, or we're talking about okay, we're only doing 5 average, exercises per session. One of the main, or I guess most common questions that we get, or sometimes they're even posed as complaints, is hey, you're giving me these workouts. It took me 10 minutes. What's going on? This isn't enough work because I flew through it. I need to be doing more. And that brings us back to, again, the fatigue that is generated from hard work means you need to be resting in between. So one of the most common things that I will see is that if you're able to, go from set to set with 3 to 5 deep breaths, which might be, 20 to 30 seconds in between, and be able to do it again, you didn't work hard enough. I can, sometimes my sessions that only have 2 hard movements in, like a lunge and a squat pattern, it'll take me 45 minutes to get through just my lunges alone because I have to rest so long in between. So I don't necessarily want to talk about optimal rep ranges and things like that, but just wanted to also throw out that if you're working hard enough with that level of intensity, that small, quote unquote, small amount of work can still take you 45 minutes to an hour, which is, I would say, typical to what most of our programming is for our clients. That's the goal. And the intention is to get you in and out of there within roughly an hour, doing those 5 to 6 exercises, 2 to 4 on average sets of each. Sound about right for you guys too?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's 90 to 95% of what I program would be the 5 to 6 exercises, a couple compounds, some accessories, in and out. And if you thinking goal specific, if you have a compound that you specifically want to improve at, that should be the first compound you hit. Like that's the one I'm hitting today first, because it's going to take up more energy than anything else. And I want to put all my energy into that one to get maximum output, maximum results. So you could have, if you do a full body day, you could have bench and squat. But if your goal is to bench more, like if your goal is really, I want to improve my bench, my squat's okay, I really don't care about squatting that much, you should probably bench first, because if you squat before you bench, your bench is for sure going to suffer.
Yeah, fatigue carries over. So like Tori's example too, if you were trying to do bench, squat, deadlift, all of the big movements in one day, your first movement of that exercise might go pretty well. By the time you get to that last one, even if you didn't train those muscle groups, your entire nervous system is going to be so taxed and so fried that you're not going to be able to generate enough force, even if those muscles haven't necessarily been trained yet. Like fatigue in general rises. So all things to consider: exercise order, specificity, like Tom said, whatever you want to focus on and prioritize should go first. That's why we do the compounds first. And like Tori said, if your goal is like a pull-up or something like that, those types of movements or movement patterns that train that exercise should be prioritized and emphasized in those sessions as well. So I think that was a pretty good general overview of kind of, basic programming considerations. Does anyone have any kind of last minute, make sure you think about this? This is the most common thing I see, or most common questions I get from clients or anything like that?
If all of this was super overwhelming, go to level10coaching.co and we have templates and programs written for you. So you don't have to put the guesswork into it.
Yeah, and I think that this kind of, unless you have specific questions, certainly drop them down in the comments and we can either answer them there or create a separate video talking about more specific topics, whether they be goal related or training programming or not. We all are also working on putting together more videos in terms of stress management practices, nutritional interventions, and things like that. So be on the lookout for those as well. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel as a whole, like and comment, so that other people see this as well. And like Tori said, if you have any further questions or are more curious about what we do at Level 10, go ahead and go to the website and look at all of the options and all of the free resources that we offer as well, with our blog posts and in weekly emails and things like that. So thanks for listening. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one.